Michael Reeves stood in the living room of his suburban Cincinnati home, staring out the window at the soft glow of streetlights against the darkening sky. His reflection on the glass looked calm, almost serene, but inside, unease stirred. At 34, he had always been good at controlling his emotions, a skill honed by years of negotiating high-stakes real estate deals. But tonight, the calm was an act, a fragile veneer over a growing sense of something not quite right. His wife, Vana, had been gone for hours. She'd said she was meeting her mother, Ruth, for dinner. It wasn't unusual, the two women were close. Michael had always admired that bond, especially since his own parents had passed away years ago. Still, Vana's absences had become more frequent in the last few months, and the explanations, while reasonable, often felt rehearsed. Michael glanced at his watch. Almost 9 p.m. He returned to the kitchen, where he'd abandoned the pasta he'd been half-heartedly cooking. The house was quiet, too quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. Normally, he found solitude comforting, a chance to recharge from the constant demands of his job. But lately, the silence seemed heavier. His phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. A text from Vana lit up the screen, running late. "Be home soon. Love you." Michael read the words twice. There was nothing unusual about them, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. He set the phone down and leaned against the counter, letting his mind wander back to the past few months. It had started subtly. Vana, who was normally warm and affectionate, had grown distant. It wasn't obvious at first, missed kisses in the morning, distracted smiles in the evenings. Michael had attributed it to the pregnancy. After all, this was a major life change for both of them. He'd done his best to support her, attending doctor's appointments and taking over more of the household chores. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore the shift in her demeanor. Even her relationship with Ruth, which had always been close, seemed different. Ruth visited more frequently now, often while Michael was at work. He'd come home to find their teacup still on the counter, their laughter echoing faintly in his memory. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. One night, a week earlier, Michael had overheard a fragment of their conversation as he entered the house. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the sound of his name had stopped him in his tracks. "You just need to stay calm," Ruth had said, her voice low and urgent. "If Michael gets suspicious." Michael had stepped into the room before she could finish. Both women had fallen silent, their expressions shifting to forced cheerfulness. "Michael. You're home early," Vana had said, her smile tight. That night, lying awake in bed beside her, Michael had replayed the moment in his mind. He'd wanted to ask what Ruth had meant, but something held him back. A part of him didn't want to know. The sound of the front door opening pulled Michael from his thoughts. He turned to see Vana step inside, her cheeks flushed from the cool autumn air. She was dressed in a fitted coat over a dark sweater and jeans, her belly just starting to show. She looked beautiful, as always, but her expression was hurried, almost anxious. "You're home late," Michael said, keeping his tone light. "Sorry," Vana replied, slipping off her shoes. "Mom and I lost track of time." She offered a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Michael watched as she disappeared into the bathroom, the door clicking shut behind her. He leaned against the counter, his unease deepening. There it was again, that faint, floral perfume. It wasn't Vana's. When she emerged, her expression had softened. "How was your day?" she asked, moving to hug him. Michael returned the embrace, inhaling the faint trace of the unfamiliar scent. Same old," he replied. "How was dinner with your mom?" "Good," she said quickly. Too quickly. Michael forced a smile, burying his doubts. "I'm glad. You should get some rest." Vana nodded, heading to the bedroom. Michael lingered in the kitchen, staring at the half-cooked pasta and wondering when his life had started to feel like a puzzle missing too many pieces. The next morning, Michael awoke to find Vana already up. She was in the living room, speaking softly on the phone. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably serious. She ended the call abruptly when she saw him. "Morning," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Morning," Michael replied, his mind racing. He considered asking who she'd been talking to but decided against it. Instead, he kissed her on the cheek and left for work, his thoughts heavier than usual. That evening, Ruth came over. Michael arrived home to find the two women sitting on the couch, their conversation halting as he entered. "Michael," Ruth said, standing to greet him. "How's work?" "Busy," he replied, shaking her hand. "And you? How's everything?" Ruth smiled, but there was something guarded in her expression. "Fine, just fine. I was just about to head out." Michael watched her go, the unease in his chest growing stronger. As the door closed behind her, he turned to Vana. "You and your mom have been spending a lot of time together lately." "She's just excited about the baby," Vana said quickly, avoiding his gaze. "You know how she is." Michael nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. That night, as he lay in bed, he made a decision. He needed answers. Whatever was going on, he was done being in the dark. The following week, Michael found himself walking a tightrope between suspicion and denial. He wanted to believe in Vana, to trust the woman he had promised to share his life with. Yet, the pieces that didn't fit were piling up faster than he could brush them aside. Every late-night outing, every nervous glance, every half-hearted explanation scratched at the fragile surface of his trust. It was Ruth's visit on Thursday evening that finally tipped the scales. Michael arrived home early that day, determined to spend some time with Vana. The ultrasound appointment was scheduled for the next week, and he wanted to feel closer to her, to share in the excitement of their growing family. But as he pulled into the driveway, Ruth's car was already parked outside. The sight of it sent an inexplicable chill down his spine. He entered quietly, the sound of muffled voices drawing him toward the living room. Ruth's voice, usually warm and inviting, held a sharp edge. "You have to be careful, Vana," Ruth was saying. "Don't go out with him again, not in public. If Michael finds out the baby isn't his, he'll never forgive you." Michael froze. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the rest of their conversation. "The baby isn't his." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything he had ever heard. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath him, his breath caught in his throat. "You don't have to keep reminding me, Mom," Vana replied, her voice tight. "I've thought everything through. When the baby's born, I'll file for divorce. Michael's too responsible to abandon his own child, or at least the one he thinks is his. Between the house and the child support, we'll be set." A cold, nauseating realization washed over Michael. They weren't just betraying him. They were planning his downfall. He stepped back from the doorway, his heart hammering in his chest. For a fleeting moment, he wanted to burst into the room, to confront them both and demand answers. But he stopped himself. This wasn't the moment. If they were capable of this level of deception, he needed to be smart, smarter than they thought he was. He retreated to the kitchen, masking his trembling hands by busying himself with dinner preparations. The sound of voices in the living room faded as Ruth left shortly after. Vana entered the kitchen a few minutes later, a bright, practiced smile on her face. "Hey, you're home early," she said, crossing the room to kiss him on the cheek. Michael forced himself to meet her gaze, keeping his expression neutral. "Figured I'd surprise you. Thought we could have dinner together." "That's sweet." She opened the fridge, pulling out a bottle of sparkling water. "Mom stopped by. She brought over some old baby clothes of mine. You should have seen the little onesies, they're adorable." Michael nodded, his stomach churning at how easily she lied. "Sounds nice." Vana busied herself with setting the table, chattering about her day, while Michael's thoughts swirled. Every word she spoke sounded hollow now, every movement rehearsed. The woman he had built his life with was a stranger. That night, after Vana had fallen asleep, Michael sat in the glow of his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Spying on his wife felt like a betrayal of his own values, but he couldn't ignore the words he'd overheard. "The baby isn't his." He typed "private investigator near me" into the search bar and began scrolling through the results. He didn't want to do this, but he needed clarity. Facts. Proof. By morning, he had scheduled a meeting with a highly recommended investigator named Stephen Calloway. The meeting with Calloway took place the next day in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Stephen was a grizzled man in his late 50s, his sharp eyes betraying years of experience. Michael laid out the situation carefully, omitting no detail. "I need to know the truth," Michael said, his voice low. "I can't live with this uncertainty." Stephen nodded, jotting down notes. "You'll have it. Just be prepared, sometimes the truth isn't what you want to hear." Michael swallowed hard, his resolve hardening. "I'd rather face the truth than live a lie." In the days that followed, Michael's unease grew as Stephen's updates trickled in. Vana's outings were more frequent than he'd realized. She wasn't going to yoga classes. She wasn't spending extra time with her mother. The name, Colin, surfaced, a man Michael didn't know. Photographs accompanied the reports, Vana laughing with a well-dressed man outside a downtown restaurant, their heads close in conversation. Another shot showed them entering a boutique hotel. Michael stared at the images in disbelief, his chest tight with anger and hurt. Yet, he felt a strange sense of vindication. The lies were no longer whispers in his mind. They were documented, undeniable. Stephen's final report included detailed timelines, text message records, and financial discrepancies that further confirmed the affair. But it was the last piece of information that shook Michael to his core, a paternity test. The unborn child was not his. Michael spent the weekend alone, claiming a work trip to give himself space to think. He wandered the quiet shoreline of a nearby lake, wrestling with his emotions. Anger burned hot and sharp, but beneath it was a deep sadness, a mourning for the life he thought he had, for the child he'd already begun to love. By Sunday evening, Michael had made a decision. He would not confront Vana, yet. If she was planning to use him, to take his house and manipulate him for child support, he would play the long game. He would gather his own resources, quietly shifting finances and consulting with a lawyer. Vana and Ruth had underestimated him, and that would be their undoing. As he pulled into the driveway that evening, the house loomed before him, its warm lights a stark contrast to the cold reality inside. Michael took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was no longer just his home. It was a battleground. Michael Reeves had always prided himself on being a man of logic. For years, he'd believed in the power of reason to solve problems, to navigate life's inevitable challenges. But now, reason seemed like a faint whisper in the back of his mind, drowned out by the roaring tempest of betrayal and anger that consumed him. The truth was out. The child Vana carried wasn't his. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with had betrayed him, not only with another man but with a scheme so coldly calculated it made his blood run cold. But Michael wasn't the type to lash out in rage. He knew that acting on emotion would only give Vana the upper hand. Instead, he would do what he did best, strategize. It started with small changes. Michael spent hours reviewing their finances, identifying weak points in the safety net he'd built for their future. He discovered just how deeply intertwined their accounts were, how much control Vana would have if things went the way she planned. Slowly and methodically, he began to untangle the web. He opened a new bank account in his name only, transferring his savings and redirecting his paycheck. He changed the passwords on his investment accounts, ensuring Vana couldn't access them. The house, already under his name, was secure, but he verified the details with his lawyer just to be certain. Michael also began to watch Vana more closely. Every interaction became a performance, his words and gestures measured and deliberate. He continued to play the part of the doting husband, masking the storm that brewed beneath the surface. But behind the scenes, he was gathering evidence and allies. Stephen Calloway, the private investigator, proved invaluable. Armed with surveillance footage, financial records, and text logs, Michael now had a dossier of undeniable proof. The name Colin became more than a shadow, he was a real man, a real threat. Colin Harris, a rising star entrepreneur in the tech industry, had been spending time with Vana for nearly a year. The hotel visits, the clandestine dinners, the shared secrets, it was all laid bare. The night Michael decided to confront Vana's duplicity began like any other. She was in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner while humming a tune. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air, and for a moment, Michael allowed himself to remember the early days of their marriage when moments like these had been genuine. But the memory quickly soured, replaced by the weight of what he knew. He entered the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter. "Smells good," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Vana turned, her smile radiant but hollow. "Just a little something for us. I figured you've been working so hard lately, you deserve a nice meal." Michael nodded, watching her with the same quiet intensity he used during negotiations. "I appreciate that. You know, I've been thinking a lot about us lately." "Oh," Vana said, her voice light. She turned back to the stove, but he saw the slight stiffening in her shoulders. "About the baby," he continued. "About our future." Vana glanced over her shoulder, her expression guarded. "That's sweet. I think about that a lot too." Michael stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "And I've been thinking about trust. About how important it is in a marriage." Vana froze, the spoon in her hand hovering over the saucepan. "Of course," she said carefully. "Trust is everything." "That's good to hear," Michael said, his voice deceptively calm. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Because I found something recently that made me question it." He placed the paper on the counter, sliding it toward her. Vanna's eyes flicked to the document, and her breath hitched. It was a printout of a text exchange, one of many between her and Colin. Her hand trembled as she set down the spoon. "Michael, I can explain." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice cold now. "Don't insult me with more lies." Vanna's face crumpled, but Michael saw no remorse, only fear. "It wasn't what it looks like," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was lonely, and you were always working, Anne." Michael raised a hand, silencing her. "You've been seeing him for a year." "A year, Vana. While I was working to build a life for us, you were out with him. And now, you're carrying his child." Vanna's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. How did you know?" "I'm not as naive as you think," Michael said, his voice hard. "I know everything. The affair. The baby. Even your little plan to take the house and child support. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out?" Tears filled Vanna's eyes, but Michael felt no sympathy. "Michael, please," she whispered. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I love you. I swear I do." Michael laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "Love? Is that what you call this? Manipulating me? Plotting against me?" "Michael, I was scared," Vana pleaded. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought." "You thought I was a fool," Michael snapped, cutting her off. "You thought you could use me, trap me, and walk away with everything." Vana reached for his arm, but he pulled away. "Please," she begged. "Give me a chance to make this right. We can fix this. We can still have a life together." Michael shook his head, his gaze piercing. "There's no fixing this, Vana. Not after what you've done." He stepped back, his voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. Tonight. You'll stay with your mother or whoever else will take you in. And you won't come back." "But the baby," she began, her voice trembling. "The baby isn't mine," Michael said coldly. "And I won't let you use it to manipulate me." Vana sobbed, her hands covering her face. Michael felt a flicker of the love he once had for her, but it was quickly extinguished by the weight of her betrayal. As he turned and walked away, Michael felt a strange sense of clarity. This was just the beginning. Vana had played her hand, and now it was his turn. Michael Reeves stood in the doorway of his home, staring at the empty living room. Vana had left 2 hours ago, her pleas still echoing in his mind. She'd packed a single suitcase, her tearful face etched with disbelief, but Michael had remained firm. There was no room for negotiation. Trust, once shattered, could never be repaired. Now, the house felt eerily quiet, as if it were holding its breath. The photographs on the walls, vacations, anniversaries, the smiling couple they used to be, mocked him. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, the place where they would raise a family. Instead, it had become the stage for deceit and manipulation. Michael moved to the couch, sinking into its familiar embrace. In his hands was the thick dossier compiled by Stephen Calloway, the private investigator. Each page told the story of a betrayal so intricate, it bordered on malicious. Vana's texts with Colin were brazen, their plans to use Michael's resources chillingly calculated. The ultrasound appointment, the baby names she'd brainstormed, all of it was part of an elaborate act to ensure Michael's compliance. And then there was Ruth. Her complicity in the scheme was a blow Michael hadn't seen coming. He'd always liked Ruth, even admired her fierce loyalty to her daughter. But now he saw that loyalty for what it truly was, a willingness to cross any line to secure her family's future. The next morning, Michael met with his lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Evelyn Carter. Her office, lined with rows of legal tomes and sleek furniture, exuded the same precision that defined her work. "You've done well to get ahead of this," Evelyn said, flipping through the evidence Michael had provided. "We can use this to protect your assets and your reputation. But you need to be prepared, things might get messy." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "What about the baby? I need to make sure there's no way she can claim I'm the father." Evelyn's expression softened slightly. "Paternity tests are clear-cut, but that doesn't mean Vana won't try to complicate things. She may claim the baby is yours to gain leverage. We'll need to file preemptively to establish the truth in court." Michael leaned forward, the weight of the situation pressing on him. "Do it. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. I want this over." The following days passed in a blur of legal meetings and financial maneuvers. Michael kept to his routine, attending work and maintaining an air of normalcy, but inside, he felt like a man walking a tightrope. Every phone call, every email, felt like a potential bombshell waiting to explode. Vana, meanwhile, had taken refuge at Ruth's apartment. Michael knew this because Stephen Calloway's surveillance hadn't stopped with Vana's departure. The investigators' updates provided a grim picture: Vana and Ruth strategizing, late-night phone calls to Colin, and cryptic conversations that hinted at their next move. It wasn't until a week later that the first sign of retaliation appeared. Michael returned home to find an official-looking envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a letter from Vana's lawyer, demanding spousal support and interim access to the marital home. The wording was polite but firm, outlining her intention to claim her rightful share of their assets. Michael read the letter twice, his anger simmering. She's still playing the victim. He immediately forwarded the document to Evelyn, who responded within minutes. "She's bluffing," Evelyn said over the phone. "The evidence we have will dismantle her claims. But we'll need to counter this publicly. Are you ready for that?" Michael hesitated. The thought of airing their dirty laundry in court made his stomach turn, but he knew there was no alternative. "I'm ready." That evening, Michael sat in his darkened living room, the television flickering with muted images of a football game he wasn't watching. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number lighting up the screen. "Unknown, I'm sorry for everything. Please, let's talk." Michael stared at the message, his emotions a tangled knot. He knew it was Vana, but her words rang hollow. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he replied. "Michael, there's nothing to talk about. You made your choices." The response came almost immediately. "Unknown, you don't understand. This wasn't just about me. There are things you don't know. Please, give me a chance to explain." Michael frowned, the message stirring a faint unease. What didn't he know? Against his better judgment, he typed a reply. "Michael, if you have something to say, say it." For several minutes, there was no response. Then, a single text arrived, cryptic and unsettling. "Unknown, meet me at the park tomorrow. Noon. Come alone." The next day, Michael found himself standing in the chilly autumn air at the edge of the park. The playground was empty, the swings creaking in the wind. Vana sat on a bench near the fountain, her figure small and subdued against the backdrop of falling leaves. He approached cautiously, his guard up. "You have 5 minutes," he said flatly. Vana looked up, her face pale and drawn. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I know I don't deserve your time." Michael crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "Get to the point." Vana hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she began. At first, I thought I could handle everything. But then Ruth got involved, and Colin, he made promises. Michael's jaw tightened. You expect me to believe you were manipulated? You knew exactly what you were doing. I didn't. Vana's voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was scared, Michael. Scared of losing everything. Scared of not being enough for you. Enough? Michael's voice rose, incredulous. You weren't enough, so you lied. You cheated. You used me. I was wrong, Vana admitted, her voice trembling. But you have to understand, Colin isn't who you think he is. He's dangerous. He's... A sudden noise cut her off, a sharp crack like a branch snapping. Michael turned instinctively, his eyes scanning the park. But the space was empty, save for a figure in the distance, retreating into the shadows. When he turned back, Vana's face was pale. I shouldn't have come, she whispered, rising abruptly. I shouldn't have said anything. Michael grabbed her arm, his voice firm. If there's something I need to know, you better say it now. But Vana pulled away, her fear palpable. I can't, she said, her voice barely audible. Just, be careful. And with that, she was gone, leaving Michael standing alone in the cold. The encounter at the park left Michael more unsettled than he cared to admit. Vana's cryptic warning, her fear, her retreat, played on an endless loop in his mind. He wanted to dismiss her words as another manipulation, a last-ditch attempt to regain control. But the mention of Colin being dangerous had struck a nerve. For days, Michael carried on as if nothing had changed. His lawyer filed motions to contest Vana's claims, and Stephen Calloway continued his surveillance, feeding him updates about her movements and interactions with Colin. Michael's focus remained sharp, his resolve steely. He had spent weeks ensuring that every financial and legal safeguard was in place. Yet, beneath his controlled exterior, unease festered like a wound he couldn't reach. It was late on a Friday evening when the first crack in his carefully constructed armor appeared. Michael had just returned home from a long day at work. He was heading upstairs when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Stephen. Stephen, you need to see this. Check your email. Now. Michael opened his laptop, the glow of the screen lighting the darkened room. His inbox contained a new folder from Stephen labeled Urgent. He clicked it open, his stomach nodding as the first image loaded. The photos showed Colin meeting with a man in a dimly lit parking garage. The stranger was tall, dressed in a black coat, his face partially obscured. The two appeared deep in conversation, the tension between them palpable even in the still frames. Then came the second photo, a briefcase exchanged. The final image was the most chilling. Colin was walking away, his face lit by the faint glow of his phone. The caption below the image read, "Call records confirm this message was sent to Vana immediately after the meeting." Michael scrolled further. The message itself had been recovered, decrypted, and translated by Stephen's team. Colin, everything is in place. Make sure Michael doesn't see it coming. Michael stared at the words, his pulse hammering in his ears. It was no longer just about betrayal or financial ruin. Whatever Colin and Vana were planning, it was bigger than he'd imagined, and infinitely more dangerous. The next morning, Michael went to Stephen's office. The investigator was waiting with more details. This isn't just an affair, Stephen said, his tone grim. Colin Harris isn't just some entrepreneur. He's tied to several fraudulent ventures, and there's evidence he's involved in blackmail and extortion schemes. He doesn't just destroy lives, he profits from it. Michael sat in stunned silence as Stephen continued. The briefcase exchange. Likely payment for services. My contact believes Colin is preparing to make you the fall guy in a larger scheme. If Vana's working with him, they could be planning to frame you. For what? Michael demanded, his voice rising. Anything, Stephen replied. Fraud. Embezzlement. Whatever sticks. They've already set the groundwork by painting you as the villain in the divorce proceedings. If they can tie you to something criminal, they'll walk away clean, and wealthy. Michael clenched his fists. How do we stop them? Stephen's expression darkened. That's the tricky part. People like Colin don't just back down. If you confront him without leverage, he'll double down, and he won't hesitate to escalate. Michael didn't have to wait long for escalation. That night, as he pulled into his driveway, a car with tinted windows idled at the curb. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, but Michael felt their gaze on him as he entered the house. His phone buzzed moments later, a message from an unknown number. "Unknown, we know you've been digging. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Michael stared at the message, a cold weight settling in his chest. He forwarded it to Stephen, who responded immediately. "Stephen, don't engage. Stay inside. I'll send someone to monitor your house." But Michael couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger. He locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat in the living room, his mind racing. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing outside. Then, just after midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Michael grabbed his phone, the faint glow of the screen his only light. He moved to the kitchen, searching for the flashlight he kept in a drawer. As he rummaged through the drawer, a sound froze him in place, a soft creak, like a footstep on the wooden floor behind him. "Who's there?" Michael called out, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Silence. He turned slowly, his phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The living room was empty, the shadows unmoving. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. Another sound, a faint scrape, this time from the back door. Michael's grip on his phone tightened as he moved cautiously toward the noise. The door was ajar, the lock broken. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Michael barely had time to react before something struck him hard across the head. Pain exploded in his skull, and he fell to the ground, his vision swimming. As consciousness slipped away, he heard a voice, low, cold, and familiar. "You should have stayed in the dark, Michael." When Michael awoke, he was lying on the floor, his head pounding and his vision blurred. The house was ransacked, drawers pulled open, papers scattered everywhere. His phone was gone, along with his laptop and the dossier Stephen had compiled. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They'd taken everything, every piece of evidence, every safeguard he'd built. The police arrived an hour later, but the damage was done. Vana and Colin had covered their tracks well, leaving no trace of their involvement. As the officers filed their report, Michael sat in silence, his mind racing. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Prominent real estate consultant investigated for fraud. Colin and Vana's plan had succeeded. Michael was the villain now, his reputation in tatters, his future uncertain. As he stared at the newspaper, a single thought consumed him: this isn't over. But deep down, he knew the battle was already lost. What would you do in Michael's shoes? Was there any way out of this twisted web? Share your thoughts on this shocking tale of betrayal below.